Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, February 28th, 2022, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And before we dive into this week's episode, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible each and every week. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download, and that's because I rely on the support of listeners just like you, along with my advertising partners. If you want to support the show, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy. This week, I want to thank Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, Christopher Pitts, Dudas Infinitas, Gabriel F. Jaramillo Gonzalez, June Sapare, Leonard Prince, and Ulrika Hagman for their support of the show. All right, let's dive into it. So this week I had the opportunity to sit down with the author of the new book, The Genesis Machine, Our Quest to Rewrite Life in the Age of Synthetic Biology, Amy Webb. So Amy is a futurist. She's actually a professor of strategic foresight. Yes, that is what she teaches at New York University's Stern School of Business. There she developed an MBA level strategic foresight course with live case studies. She's also the founder of the Future Today Institute, which is a leading foresight and strategy firm that helps leaders and their organizations prepare for complex futures. So, she's really focused on data-driven, technology-led foresight methodology, and she's used this with tons of different organizations. Her new book, of course, focuses on synthetic biology. What is synthetic biology? What kind of does it hold for the future? And where do we need to manage risk? Where do we need to make sure that our regulation is really, really strong? It's a fascinating chat about, once again, the Genesis Machine, our quest to rewrite life in the age of synthetic biology. So without any further ado, here she is, Amy Webb. Amy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Cara.
I am excited to talk to you about your newest book. I'm excited to talk to you about kind of just futurism in general, but also more specifically synthetic biology, sort of transgenics, genetic biology, and what the future holds. And I thought, tell me if you think this is a good approach. I thought we could talk first about what these concepts are. Second, about what some specific sort of translational examples of them are, real world examples. And then third, obviously the ethics, right? The risks, the benefits, the ethics. Like, this is sort of the big, big question on the horizon.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a great roadmap.
Awesome. So let's just start with the biggest kind of question that's out there. So your book is called The Genesis Machine, Our Quest to Rewrite Life in the Age of Synthetic Biology. So first I want to talk about what is synthetic biology, but then I want to talk about where you came up with that title. Like, what do you envision as the Genesis Machine?
Sure. So this ultimately is just a book about a new technology that will allow us to edit, redesign, and even create new forms of life. And what that's going to do is give us some options to deal with existential threats like climate change and novel pathogens. And it will probably also improve human longevity. So the book centers on a field of science that is still emerging, and it's called synthetic biology. And I know that sounds a little tricky, but this is a relatively new interdisciplinary field that combines engineering, design, computer science, and biology. And what researchers are trying to do is to design or redesign organisms on a molecular level to give them new purposes, to make them adaptable to different environments, to give them enhanced abilities. And ultimately, all of these techniques, which fall under the broad umbrella that is synthetic biology, are going to give us the access code to life, which is pretty exciting. And I think probably 10 years from now, we're going to be talking about synthetic biology the way that we talk about AI today, which means everybody will be talking about it, and there'll be a lot of misunderstanding and probably a lot of promises made. And my hope in people reading this book today is that we'll be able to arrive at that point and have more thoughtful, informed conversations.
Right. So, when I think of synthetic biology, I think of Craig Venter. I think of, actually kind of not not a long time ago, but decades old innovations in trying to draw a genetic code utilizing synthetic, meaning, produced in a lab, made from sometimes non-organic materials, kind of writing new DNA, saying, okay, I'm going to design a genetic code and see if I can make an organism out of that. That's sort of where my head goes
Yeah,
right at the
that's right.
beginning.
Yeah. So Craig Venter is among several people who are really pushing this field forward. And the book is very much about people. It's the stories of the people and the research they've been doing. It's a very human-centered approach to the stories that we're telling. But for those of you not familiar with Craig Venter, he's a maverick. And years ago, when the Human Genome Project race was heating up, he really pushed scientists to think differently. And he did so in a way sometimes that probably wasn't the most political, meaning, he ruffled a few feathers here and there. People totally hated him for it, especially James Watson. And this, I think there's like someday, I hope to God somebody makes a movie about the Human Genome Project race to the end. But basically, this story is so awesome. So at this point, Craig Venter he's a veteran, he's a surfer, he's got long hair, he's a maverick. And he does not really want to abide by the traditional roles and rules that you would find in a lab or in a university. And James Watson, on the other hand, has kind of been put in charge of a massive, sprawling, enormous, fraught government project to decode the human genome. And, Watson may have been a pretty good scientist, but he was not a great manager. He was also very much not interested in women or people of color.
I was going to say, he was also not a great person.
he was kind of like I'd like to keep this episode clean in the event that kids are listening, but like, he was not a good dude. Not even close. And, so in addition to Watson totally not giving credit to Rosalind Franklin for all of the work that she did that underpinned the discovery of the double helix that ultimately he got credit for, he really did not like Craig Venter. And all that did was, Craig over and over again had these phenomenally brilliant ideas and just kept getting chastised for them because they were different. It forced other scientists to sort of break their mental models and think about things in a different way. Anyways, but he was also, he liked to be in the spotlight a little bit, I think. And there's this crazy story of lots of heated arguments, and oh my gosh, at times they were yelling at each other in public, and Watson said some horrible things, and ultimately Craig won. Like, he got there first, and it became this crazy juggernaut that ultimately it was Bill Clinton who brokered a kind of a truce, and they agreed to co-present once the Genome Project was done. I mean, Venter was way ahead, but they sort of jointly announced that the project had been completed.
Because he's this guy sort of like with his own lab on a boat at one point, like just out in the ocean, kind of doing his own thing. Up again, like it's a David and Goliath thing, right? So of course it doesn't look good to the American government that this bro on a boat sequenced the genome first.
I love that image. You're absolutely right. I don't think he was technically on a boat at that point, but yeah, no, he nobody wanted this story of a probably kind of hippie, out there, crazy maverick scientist. In my head at this point in history, I kind of have like this cross between Tom Cruise and Top Gun, and the dude from The Big Lebowski. Like, I'm sure that's not, but that's in my head.
That's funny because I only see Craig Venter as bald, and maybe that's just because I see all of his press photos, from way later.
Right. He is now, but back in the day, he had longer hair. And anyways, he has pushed the field forward, and he probably attracted more ire than compliments. And there were definitely concerns, and I think legitimate concerns at some point, that part of what he was doing was making sure that he had the rights to the IP, meaning as parts of the genome were being decoded, they were doing this using some proprietary computer technology that would have meant that while the sequences were available to everybody, you kind of had to use the technology in order to make sense of them.
Which, to be
And
fair, I mean, whether ethically you agree with this approach or not, this is not uncommon in scientific endeavors, right?
no, and
Like,
listen, from my point of view, if we're going to talk smack about Venter trying to build a business out of this, then we ought to talk
mhm,
smack about all of the academic journals that, I mean, I read
right.
700 academic papers working on this book, and I have subscriptions
Jeez.
to a handful, not like all at once. It was over a series of like 3 years.
Still,
But
yeah.
do you have any concept of how expensive it was to do that type of reading? It is
No, because
crazy.
I have access through my university. I'm very lucky, right? Because
Yeah.
they have these massive institutional subscriptions. And then I've found
Right.
ways to find articles. But yeah, it's if you had to pay for every single journal article, like the individual price for the article, what is that?
Right.
Like between $30 and $75 an article probably?
Yeah. And so I understand that there was criticism about creating a situation in which you would have there would probably be a gateway at some point in order to use the research. There's another part of this conversation, which is the research is already gated, and there's already
Exactly.
paywalls that keep most people out. And I too am at a university, and so I too have access, but I didn't have access to everything.
Exactly, yeah. And also there are
So
institutional, like, quote unquote paywalls. Just you have to be in the club, right? If you're not in the club, you're probably not going to be aware of what's going on. You're not going to have access to the right people, to the right data. Just being an everyday citizen means that there's so much going on in the scientific community that you are completely unaware of.
right, that's absolutely right. And I think that's a really salient point because there is some mistrust of science, the science. And I think part of that has to do with this divide, this chasm, information asymmetry, right? If you're in the club, you get access to the research. If you're not in the club, not only do you not get access, but there's nobody there translating it for you.
And then you
And
don't know who to listen. I mean, this is why we're seeing
right,
this
right,
like
right.
Joe Rogan, Spotify, Robert Malone, kerfuffle, like because when you don't have that sort of background knowledge, you don't have that sort of guidance, and you don't, you're sort of outside of that institution. Somebody comes from the institution and says, "Hey, let me tell you something." Either that you want to hear, that has confirmation bias attached to it, or that hey, I'm going rogue. I have insider knowledge that other people aren't going to share with you. That's really appealing.
I completely agree. I think a solution to that is here's what you missed on Glee. You ever watch that show Glee?
No,
A
I
billion years
didn't,
ago.
but I hear
Let's
you.
talk
I hear
about the
you.
hard sciences and really crappy American television. There needs to be like a summary, not the abstract, but really and truly, because we know with pre-pub servers now, journalists are certainly reading through these, at least the abstracts. Everybody is, and like you either have to write the heck out of that abstract, or you have to assume that people are going to take some things out of context. So, I think that even if we're going to keep the academic papers free, there needs to be some type of meaningful abstract translated for the normal person who might happen upon the website. And especially when some of the research is more tricky or is like likely to be taken out of context or misunderstood, there should be an FAQ. Just
Completely
like,
agree. I
here's
mean,
what we meant. And I know that's going to take a lot of extra time to write, but that's really important because science, it's never been like your podcast is so important because it's never been more important to do effective science communication in the history of humanity than it has been, in the past couple of years.
and when individual scientists don't understand how incumbent it is on them to make efforts to to keep their research from being inaccessible, when individual scientists don't see that part of their job is communicating why they do their research, that's how they should be able to get funding. That's how they should be able to have, not just political support, but governmental support. And it bums me out. I think we're seeing a massive change as sort of younger generations are doing more and more science. But I mean, back in that, I remember decades ago being on panels and, giving talks about SciComm. And like, I'd be on panels with Nobel laureates who were like, I don't promote promote my work, and I was
Yeah.
like, oh my God.
I'd love to highlight and foreground the work of Françoise Baylis, who is a professor, a research professor at, I'm going to totally mangle the pronunciation of this. It's in Halifax, Dalhousie University.
Dollhouse, sure.
Okay.
I have
Okay.
no
There
idea.
you go.
Yeah.
Sure. Anyways, she is an ethicist. She's a philosopher, and I just did a intelligence squared debate. She was on the opposing side. George Church was my debate partner. At any rate, she was telling me about how when she's teaching her students, she makes them argue both sides. So if there's an ethical debate or a question or something having to do with the sciences, right? Like there's this crazy, wonderful research we just did. Great. Explain it to me. And now explain it to me that highlights the opportunities and explain it to me that highlights the risks. And I think that type of training is vitally important, and why I mean, she was our opposition in that debate, and we got out of the debate, and I was like, oh my gosh, you're amazing. I loved, like you were terrific.
During that debate, were you taking, I'm curious about your own kind of position, and I know we're jumping ahead like 15 steps, but you were taking the sort of pro synthetic biology, pro, I guess, transgenes, pro, these kind of futurism steps, and she was taking the we need to be more aware of the risks position.
Oh, it was much more pinpointed than that. That the resolution was gene editing should be used to to make better babies.
Oh, so it wasn't even
Yeah.
about the woolly mammoth, because I know you said
No, no,
Church
no.
was your partner.
Yeah. So he and I were on the affirmative side, meaning yes, we believe that should happen, and she was on the negative side. Now, there's a little bit of backstory here, which is I was at one point a nationally ranked debater. That was what I did in college and in high school. So when they were like, "Hey, would you like to do this?" I was like, "Absolutely! I have been waiting for this phone call like my entire life,"
But that
which
also
is true.
means you know how to debate both sides.
Well, yeah, and so they were like, "Well, where do you fall?" And I was like, "I'm just happy to be here. I'll debate either side, af or neg.
Yeah.
Let me at it." And then they were like, "But you have this book out where you're kind of saying that this is a good thing." So, and I was like, "Oh yeah, maybe I should speak in favor. That makes more sense."
But that said, you are okay. So you're kind of saying this is a good thing with a million
I
caveats.
am okay. So I am actually saying that this is a good thing. So this is a pretty incendiary, I think, headline. And people listen. If we said like resolved synthetic biology should be used for genetic surgery, I just like nobody's going to come to a debate like that. So but let me sort of explain my positioning on this. Some of the arguments against genetic interventions have to do with a genetic divide, a wealth divide, and also sort of next order impacts and unintended consequences that maybe we can't think through in advance. And I completely hear and acknowledge those arguments. However, I also know that I'm somebody who really struggled to get pregnant. Let me strike that. I struggled to stay pregnant. I was pregnant 9 times, and I have one child. And over again, I was told that there was nothing wrong with me. And I think I saw some of the best fertility specialists I could, and I think that there's a part of me that wonders if I was being dismissed. At one point, I was told to just like be less stressed, and my husband wasn't told to be less stressed. And it was like, I don't know exactly. My response was, "Are you kidding me? It's we live in modern times. This is nuts." So the truth of the matter is that it was probably a chromosomal abnormality, and if we had done IVF, which I wasn't technically a candidate for because again they didn't technically know what was wrong, and this is going back 11 years or 12 years, so elective IVF was not. I mean, in some places around the country, that was a thing, but not everywhere.
But
And I
also
was
like
just
exorbitantly expensive.
very expensive, very
Yeah.
invasive.
Yeah.
But here's where I've landed. I think that if we have an opportunity sometime in the future to create not like a couple of embryos, but like 1,000 embryos, 1,000,000 embryos, and screen those embryos for both abnormalities and potential mutations, but also run probabilistic models to determine which among those embryos are the most optimized already to succeed, and then select the embryos based on that and implant the one or possibly the two, but hopefully at that point it's just implanting one that has the greatest likelihood of success and also success in life, then why wouldn't I want to do that? And I'll be honest with you, I hope that my daughter has that ability. I hope that she has plenty of sex for fun. And I hope that she chooses IVF because it's the better way to procreate. And I also hope that at the time that she's ready to do that, which is not going to be for another couple of decades, that it's affordable and available and a reasonable option, not just for people who are wealthy or live in big cities, but for everybody.
Right. So, I mean, two things come up for me as I hear this argument. The first one is we're sort of already doing this in a less sophisticated way, right? Like we already have certain tools that allow us. We have new blood. I have a friend who's pregnant right now, and she just had a blood test that told her what her risk of having these different trisomies and different genetic abnormalities are. And she has the choice to do an elective abortion if she decides, if they come back in a way that she doesn't want to see them. And this is great because it prevents people from having to do amnio needlessly and have those risks. So we already have crude methods to do exactly what we're talking about, and nobody bats an eye at those. But the other thing that comes up is this conversation, which I've had before on the show. So kind of long story short, and I highly recommend everybody go to pbs.org, or is it .com? I don't know. But go to your local PBS station, .org, thank you. And look up I think it's a Frontline episode. It may be an American Experience episode about eugenics, and watch this sort of long form deep dive into the history of eugenics in America, and really understand that the eugenics movement was a movement that early on was accepted by most people, that the eugenics movement was a movement towards having happier, healthier families. And as it started to become corrupted by racism and by classism and by sexism and by all of these evil forces that, exist within our society and have not gone away, we started to see that the promise of eugenics early on became a totally different animal. And that animal is what we know to be eugenics now.
Right. So this is something we cover in the book. It's also, again, it's one of these bizarre topics that comes back again and again. And I'll give you an example that almost nobody knows. So when I'm not writing books, I have a day job. I'm a quantitative futurist. So my job, and I run a company, and we've been around for almost 20 years. My job is to use data to build models and look for emerging signals, and then model those signals to figure out what the next order impacts might be.
So like out into the future. So like take what's kind of happening now and see, how could this have an effect later?
Right. Now, paradoxically, futurists do not actually predict the future because there's just too much data, there's too many variables, and the math doesn't work out. However, we are trained, and it is an academic discipline that goes back a century, we're trained to build data-driven sort of what-ifs for the purpose of reducing uncertainty so we can make better decisions. Now, insanely enough, this entire field originated to some degree with H.G. Wells. Does that name ring a bell to you?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So for those of you who maybe are like, yeah, Wells, I remember that from somewhere. So he was a prolific writer at the turn of the century and wrote a bunch of very, very early science fiction novellas, one including the Time Machine. Wait, that was Jules Verne. No, that was not Jules Verne. That was that was Wells. At any rate, speaking of not remembering, so Wells was a journalist first. Kind of got into, all of the emerging technology at the time, which at the turn of the century were things like moving sidewalks and very early experiments with electricity and early cars and early radio. And he was really thinking through how all of this tech was going to change the world. So he started writing these speculative stories, but in the middle of all of this, got very fixated on the fact that there should be this study, this rigorous study of the future, because we need to plan for what's next. So like one of the best things he ever wrote was this paper with a very long title that I won't repeat because it would take too long, but basically proposing that there should be this study in every university where people are thinking through what if scenarios in a methodical way. And part of the justification that he gives for that is societies go into pieces and we need to really think through procreation. And he becomes an early sort of utopian eugenicist. And I think there was a name. I'm trying to remember. It was like what was it called?
I'm going to Google utopian eugenicist and see if anything comes up.
There's a name. This early group of people actually had a name for it, and it was something like biological, like field something utopia. But it was not because they were trying to eliminate the other, but rather because he and a few other people were trying to leave the world, the future generations smarter, basically more optimized. Optimized was clearly not a word they were using back then, but there you go.
Yeah, the idea was that this would be available to everyone and that everyone would have the opportunity to basically reduce disease, increase longevity, like all of the things that we think that modern medicine is trying to attack. That was sort of the goal. But it was a utopia, and it was obviously in many ways very short-sighted because it just straight up ignored systemic inequities. Because of course their world was the world of the white man.
Right.
And you have to remember that. To them, that's all that mattered.
Right. In fact, I think it was called biotopia.
That makes sense.
Thinking about it. All right. So you're right. And that leads to some of the themes in the book, but themes that are just persistent throughout science. It's a pretty homogenous. It has been pretty homogenous. One of after reading these 700 academic papers, at some point I went back and I was like, who's on the editorial boards of all of these places where these papers? It's all white men. Yeah,
of course.
And it is.
For more background on this, see my previous episode with Angela Saini, because that's what we talk about for a whole hour.
So here's the thing. My previous deep dive and book had to do with artificial intelligence, and that was years ago. And I'm seeing similar themes. We have these sort of tribes that get together. They are self-selecting. They are self-promoting, meaning promoting from within. And if you don't make an effort to make sure that that's a diverse group of people, then whatever the end product of all that research is, or whatever it is that's being built, may be intended for all, but it's not going to include all, right? And in the case of AI, that means the machine learning algorithms and the stuff that we encounter every day, was not built with a diversity of people in mind. And just some degree, that's still not happening even after all the public discourse. And the same is true in biology. We do. The good news is that there's a lot of data. There's a ton of data that is being used, but most of those data sets are from Caucasian people.
Yeah, even you look at 23andMe, I know that there's been a lot of kind of pushback against that it's like something crazy, like 90% of the data that they're working with is from kind of European and mostly white countries.
That's right. So what does it mean? So this is kind of my point. If we have debates about whether or not we should edit babies, I think we need to start from a different point. We need to start from, hey, if we agree that editing to some degree is important, right? Then are the tools that we're currently using the best possible ones? And the answer is probably not, because the massive data sets just don't include people who are Black and brown. There's a lot of data from women that are missing in these data sets. And so over and over again, we see these examples where, the studies didn't include the right people. And so it turns out, certain demographics have a way higher probability of something being wrong. And we missed it somehow. And this becomes important because we're moving toward an era in which artificial intelligence will be used for to speed up the process of scientific discovery, to help find therapeutics and medicines faster. And like, we really want to make sure that we're optimized for everybody in that future, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's sort of one of those things where it must be a little bit difficult when we want to talk about synthetic biology and when we want to talk about a future where these opportunities exist and the ethics of, what should be used, what shouldn't be used, where do we need to be more careful, where can we be more open? Because what you can't really do is say, okay, inequities aside, let's put that on the shelf for now and just talk about the science, because that's what
Right.
gets us into this mess, is
Right.
people
I
putting
mean,
that on the shelf.
totally. There's like plenty of examples. I can give one of that we talk about at length in the book, and that is the Native American community. So one of the tribes there was a partnership done with ASU. This is public, by the way, and the tribe had like diabetes and some other issues. So ASU asked them to if they could collect genetic samples and try to figure out what made this particular tribe more susceptible to diabetes. And it was a pretty cut and dry study. Well, in the process of doing this research, they discover, there are all of these markers for bipolarism and schizophrenia and a bunch of other things. And the initial study became something very different and got published. And this tribe was and it's like nobody cleared it through them. And it was absolutely humiliating. I mean, really, really devastatingly humiliating.
I
The
mean, and that
tribe,
sounds to me like a problem with informed consent. Like
oh,
they
yeah,
sort of said, we want your data and this is what we're going to do with it. And then they never said, oops, we decided to do something different.
right. So that's obviously the case. But the bigger problem is that lack of informed consent and just being very upfront now resulted in complete mistrust. And so after all of this happened, the Navajo Nation quite rightfully was like, yeah, none of us are submitting to any type of study like that. And, we are not going to pick up the phone when it calls or when
Of
it
course.
rings.
And then the
So
downstream effect is that they're not included.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
We
So
see this
this
all the
is
time in sub-Saharan Africa. We see this all the time,
exactly.
with like global health initiatives. But then I think there becomes this calloused kind of Western view of like blaming the victim too, of like, well, they don't trust us, so that's why we're not able to vaccinate.
Right. And it's
And it's
like,
like, "Oy, God,
yeah. But
for good
again, I
reason."
think it's absolutely not at all surprising. And if the community does not work harder to build trust and to bring more types of people into the various areas of leadership, then we're not going to, we're going to have, again, like this is an addressable problem now, right? You go 20 years into the future, this is an exacerbated issue that reigns, that brings regulation, it brings lawsuits, it brings all kinds of problems that we could stave off today. And all that requires, it just requires confronting some cherished beliefs and making room for others and making the time to build relationships and trust with other communities.
Oh, for sure. I often think about this movement from sort of etic anthropology into emic anthropology, this movement from like being on the outside observing a social group and going, the brown man does this and this, and I shall write about this in my, British journal, which is like so gross, but like basically the entire history of the National Geographic Society, and this is a company I work for, I love it, Nat Geo, but yes, this is their dark history that they've talked about a lot. The entire history of most of these academic kind of clubs, to a more emic perspective, which is probably not going to be able to talk about this unless there is a researcher from within the group who I can collaborate with. Like, it's probably important to talk about it from the perspective of the people in the group, because otherwise I'm always going to miss something.
Right. And to be fair, like, listen, we're all always going to miss something,
Right. Right.
But but I think the probability of missing something is lower the more diverse ideas that you have in the room.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And that's like, it's so sad that we have to continue to have that conversation, like that certain people just still don't get it. Because I feel like, can we just all agree on this and move forward, that we need to have more diversity in the boardroom, that we need to have more diversity? And when people go, but why? It's like, how do you not know the answer to that question?
Right.
God. And so, of course, this means that this conversation about synthetic biology, this conversation about the future of the Genesis machine, is fraught. We cannot talk about it without talking about all of these other things, because it cannot exist in a vacuum.
That's right. But again, we need to be level-headed. And I think so there's a couple of asks. The ask of the scientific community is to make sure that there's context when some of these things are being talked about. But outside of the scientific community, and this specifically relates to our policymakers and lawmakers and the business community, and especially investors, this is the kind of thing where if you wait to think critically and to develop meaningful relationships, it's not just going to be too late, but it's going to be like dangerously late. I'm concerned that the conversations we're having today about breaking up big tech could become conversations in the future where we're talking about breaking up big bio.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That suddenly we have decided that the regulatory framework we have in the US doesn't make sense. We have this sort of weird, what's called consolidated framework, which is different agencies regulating kind of sort of different parts of processes, mostly the product versus the process.
Yeah.
And
also
funding.
A lot of like gross kind of, I mean, it's a broken system. Like,
it's totally broken. Yeah.
All
so it's
too
fine.
Often regulatory agents then go and work for the very companies
Right.
they regulate. There's apparently no legal framework to prevent that.
Right.
It's insane.
So let's just acknowledge that as a potential vulnerability nationally that's going to make us less competitive. Other countries don't have that problem. And, we're just at the point, it's been 400 days, and I think we are just on the cusp of having a FDA director. That's insane that we got so politically out of whack that in the middle of a crisis, it took over a year to get somebody appointed and approved to lead a critical agency, given that in government, without those heads of the agencies, there's very little that can actually get done. So what I'm saying is we don't have a long-term plan for science in the United States.
We don't have a long-term plan for anything in the United States. We only know what's going to happen until the next election cycle.
We are very much nowists here. We are not futurists.
For sure.
Yeah. And that relates to funding basic science and research. So this gets back to the investor comment I made. This is an area that's on a long time trajectory, and there are some phenomenally wonderful companies that are working in this space that are doing great work, but they can't, like the private sector can't handle all of this on its own. We need, this should be a moonshot. Biden announced that cancer was going to be a moonshot, and then Eric Lander resigned from OSTP. He was supposed to be in charge of it. But it's not just cancer. Like cancer is something that people can sort of grok. But we need to think bigger and bolder. We can be more ambitious in how we're approaching all of this. And we just, we need a long-term moonshot strategy for synthetic biology, which is, it includes other fields like CRISPR and, all different types of research. We need a plan. We need long-term funding, and that has to be able to withstand whichever political party is in charge at that time, because China has such a plan, and they've got enormous funding. And, China has a very different approach to informed consent, and to how it treats people.
Yeah, you can do stuff like that when you're a totalitarian government. You can just say, unilaterally, we will make this decision and everyone will follow suit.
That's right. That's right.
They can make progress a lot faster than we can.
They sure can. And so while we're arguing over whether or not A should be used for B or so-and-so should be doing whatever, we've got a whole other enormous economy that has a vested interest in making sure that this technology succeeds, because they have more than 1 billion people that they have to feed and clothe and make sure there's fresh water for. And that's, synthetic biology isn't just about making better babies. In fact, it's very much not about designer babies. It's about improving and tweaking nature so that we can live in better harmony with it, hopefully, and we have better chance of success on this planet, and possibly others at some point.
Yeah, an example that comes to mind, like I want to talk about like GM, I want to talk about, there's so many things that come to mind, but an example that comes to my personal mind from the work that I do, which is more, it's like aligned with what we're talking about ethically, but not so much technologically, is that, I'm working on my dissertation right now. And in my dissertation, I'm interviewing people who are choosing to die using medical aid.
Hmm.
This is my
Nice.
area of research. I'm very
Oh,
interested in
wow.
end of life care. And it's informative. It's just meaningful. I'm loving this work that I'm doing. But there are certain avenues by which I can't even apply for funding because this is viewed as federally controversial, right? Like it's state by state approved, but the federal government hasn't quote legalized medical aid in dying across the nation. And because of that, I'm now limited to apply for certain like NIH funded grants and things like that. And I can imagine that when it comes to synthetic biology, there are similar kind of locks on progress for people because this is viewed as a controversial science.
That's right. And the reason that it's viewed, the primary reason I think why it's viewed as controversial is because some of the work involves stem cells.
Oh
And
yeah, God,
right. And
Bush. Yeah,
so
no.
this is the problem. So,
Uh-huh.
there is a bank of stem cells that has been in use for a long time, and depending on who's been in office, there have been differing views on whether or not those should be used by whom, and whether or not there can be new stem cell lines established. Now, I will note that Dr. Francis Collins, who's the outgoing or the former director, who he retired like a month ago, of the National Institutes of Health, is a very religious man. He is very Catholic and has very strong religious beliefs. He has written several books about his spiritual and religious beliefs. And he said that the existing stem cell lines should be used. And there is, I think this is the other thing to keep in mind. We have gotten acclimated behaviorally to snap decisions and responses somehow. And I partially blame social media for that and its societal effects. He said, listen, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I will say this is what I've observed religious scholars saying, who think that this work should be used and stem cells should be used. The religious doctrines that they believe in say that we're supposed to make sure that people who are alive are healthy. We have a moral obligation to each other. What the Bible does not say is at what point life begins. And this is a really tricky area. And unfortunately, we don't make room to listen to each other. But the truth is that these questions, the one that you're investigating, which is what is the end of life, and the questions that I'm investigating, which is what is the genesis of life, we have to come to some middle ground in this country because we're leaving opportunity on the table, which is a shame. And we're going to need some of that optionality because of the existential threats that we face. And I'll add one more thing, and this is on the end of life side of things. My mom was, and this is partly why I started researching the book. My mom was diagnosed with a very rare form of cancer when she was young. It's called neuroendocrine cancer. And this is one of the things where, again, the doctors were like, we don't know. We don't know where it's coming from. We can't find the primary site. It just is. And I don't think that they were lying to her. I just think that we needed a maverick. We needed somebody in the room, a venture type of person who was willing to just do things and think about things differently. It's the year 2022, and we still name cancer after the organs that the cancer affects, right? So you have pancreatic cancer, you have breast cancer,
Right, because
which is
that's the source of the tumor. Yeah, like where's the
well, it's the
primary tumor?
location of the tumor, but it's
Hmm.
not the
Yeah.
source of the tumor, right? And so it's a pretty rudimentary way for us to be thinking about this, but that's where we are. So anyhow, my mom had this rare form of cancer. There was no way to treat it other than a cocktail, a sort of double dose of chemotherapy, which was pretty horrible. And we chose together hospice. And I am grateful. I am really grateful to hospice and I do a lot of fundraising for hospice.
Yeah, hospice is so important.
It is important, but we don't talk about it. So
We also
you,
don't
you
use
sh-
it enough.
we don't use it.
Yeah. It's an
We
incredible Medicare benefit, and people I think I went to a lecture recently, and somebody, the speaker cited an insane statistic. So we know that hospice is a 6-month benefit, and the average stay in hospice is like 18 days because people just wait until the very last minute to utilize the benefit.
right, and I will tell you, we probably would not have if my mother had not been a hospice volunteer for like 20
Mhm,
years.
mhm, yeah. So you
Um,
knew the ins and outs of the
we
system. You
did.
knew what it could offer you.
We did. And we also came together as a family and we felt comfortable making a difficult decision, but a compassionate and honestly a lovely decision. Um, so, but this is kind of my point. The book this book, The Genesis Machine, is about synthetic biology, but it really is about all the conversations we need to have, but we don't have. Conversations about where does life start? What are life's origins? How does life end? And can we think of a different way to end life? And in the middle, when we're trying to give birth to new life, what happens? It's ultimately a story about life as much as it is a story about the science that we'll use to engineer life in different ways.
Oh, yeah, I love that, and I mean, with that comes all of the really hard conversations and hard questions about decisions that we are willing to make, about the carrying capacity of our planet, about how social justice and basic needs being met of the individuals that, are attempting to live harmoniously, about the value of individual life and what we as a society and a culture should be doing to support individual life. It's not just, as you said, a scientific story, but such a deeply ethical story, and one that's so important for every individual on this planet to grapple with, because there's that paradoxical thing that happens when you are riddled with existential angst because you are thinking about these big sort of secular eschatological issues, right? Like climate change and nuclear proliferation and all of these things that could result in the end of humanity. There's something that happens when you start to think deeply about these issues, where you actually, when you shine light in these dark corners, it can bring you peace. It can help you be less afraid.
Yeah, I would love to share a story with you about a
Please.
friend of mine who's a monk. It's
Yes,
kind of
please.
random, but interesting. So I lived in Japan and in China for several years, and I'm very, very connected to Japan, to my friends there, and to an amazing community called the U.S. Japan Leadership Program. So if anybody out there is interested in Japan, look at that program. There's a fellowship that's pretty great. At any rate, through this program, I made friends with a Zen Buddhist monk who is in Kyoto. His name is Taka. And I don't know, a couple years ago, we were chit chatting about like uncertainty, because uncertainty is where I live. My job is to explore uncertainty in all these different ways. And he was telling me, his job is to explore uncertainty and to talk to people about it.
And same, I would say, with my job, because I'm
yeah,
working in
exactly.
I do therapy with cancer patients.
Yeah,
Like, that's
yeah,
all
yeah.
we talk about is uncertainty.
So here's this interesting story he told me one night. He said that when he was training to become a Zen Buddhist monk, his very first day, he shows up at the temple and he goes in and he meets the senior monk, and they're getting acclimated. They're taking a tour. They're getting settled. And he says, "Okay, now your training has started." And he takes him to a room where there is a body, somebody who had passed, and tells Taka to sit with the body all night long and watch over the body. And now that's in a lot of religions, in Judaism and Buddhism, that is something that is done. The bodies are cremated or they're buried very quickly, and you don't typically leave them alone. But this guy is like a kid, basically, and this is his first night in the temple. And the point of this was obviously compassion for the person who had passed, but the other part of this was actually training, being faced all night long in the quiet alone with mortality and contemplating mortality and trying to sit with the feelings of uncertainty and being uncomfortable and being okay that those feelings existed. And I think what, obviously that had a profound impact on me. And I think about that story all the time. I think we don't like to talk about where does life come from or where does life end. We just sort of repeat what we've already heard. And I think doctors and scientists kind of get into the same routine where they don't want to hear people. They don't want to work on, a lot of times they don't want to work on complicated diagnostics. They're just like, here's some medicine, go away.
Yeah, even doctors with whom this is their world, like even oncologists, I find very often don't want to go there. They don't want to talk about death.
Some of that, my husband's a doctor, so some of this is, the realities of the U.S. healthcare system is you just don't have all day to spend with patients. He's in private practice, and he and I are pretty mission aligned, and he does things very, very differently, and we'll sit all day long and chit chat on the phone and until he figures out what's wrong. But he's one in a million. Anyhow, my point
it's a
is
unicorn for sure.
It's a unicorn.
Yeah.
So my point is that it's okay to feel uncomfortable, and it's okay to remember that you have free will, I think, and you can break free of the constraints that you think are surrounding you to chart your own course for the future. And I think as it relates to synthetic biology, that's what some of these scientists are trying to do. They're trying to chart a better course to the future. And they recognize that we have ethical concerns, regulatory issues. This is hard stuff. But the people I really admire in the field are the ones who are willing to have all those conversations, maybe even go a little slower as they're building so that this becomes a benefit to all.
Absolutely, because the truth is someone out there is going to do. We saw this in China, right? With the synthetic, I don't know if you would call them synthetic, but with the babies,
twins.
The twins with the HIV, and so this is going to happen regardless because we have the tools available. And if there is a tool, someone's going to use it.
Right.
And, pretending like it's not going to happen is not a way to get in front of the ethical concerns that arise with it. We have to face them head on.
That's right. And I don't mean to be glib, but, a fork can be a deadly weapon if you stab somebody in the face with it.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Oh my gosh. I have to I just have to follow up with that. I had this profound moment. Have you seen the W. Kamau Bell, Bill Cosby special on, I think it's on Showtime?
No, but do I want to? Do I want to watch that?
Well, that's the whole thing. It's called We've Got to Talk About Bill Cosby. It's a pretty intense special with a lot of interviews with people who knew him and really dives deep into his darkness and sort of I think shines the light on the terrible things that he did and really kind of shines a light on the survivors. But there's a point where there's a guy who's being interviewed and he's like a drug expert and they're grappling with this idea of date rape drugs. And he says at some point that this thing that was so profound to me, he's like, I think Kamau asked him something like, what's a date rape drug? By definition, he was like, that's the weirdest question to me because that's like asking what is a murder knife? Any drug that you use to help you be a better rapist is a date rape drug. Alcohol is a date rape drug. And it's true. Any tool is not inherently good or bad. It's a tool.
Right. I think what I am concerned about is the aftermath of using the tool, because unlike a murder knife or a murder fork, biology tends to be self-propagating, and at the moment, there's some work being done to engineer on and off switches, but we're not quite there yet. And, we could wind up in a situation where there's something called outcrossing, where an engineered organism has downstream impacts we don't think about, maybe then behaves differently in the real world than anticipated.
Yeah, we see this concern with GM protein sources. We see GM fish. We see this concern with gene drives, the mosquitoes that are being developed as a gene drive. What happens?
But to be fair, but this could happen anyways. I mean, if you're out on the West Coast, I'm on the East Coast. If you drive up and down the 95 corridor, there's a vine called kudzu, just covers everything. It's horrific, and it makes it look like there's it turns trees into what look like giant green sheet covered ghosts or something. And they strangle the vegetation beneath them. So that's, that's not outcrossing. That's just actually something. It's a plant that somebody introduced to the United States during the aftermath of the Dust Bowl as a way of trying to stop erosion from happening again. And, again, this was like best intended use case that went horribly wrong. So we just have to, that's fine. Like there are plenty of use cases in the natural world that happen on their own. And there's cases in the engineered world. We just need to think it through. That's it.
Absolutely.
And we need to,
and not fall victim to this like naturalistic fallacy that just because something is natural, it's inherently better or it's inherently more, I don't know, sustainable, because that's not always the case.
Right. So inherently X is not the case, I think. But I do want to point out, so we just had the Super Bowl, and I am not a huge football fan, so I was sort of not paying attention to the Super Bowl.
I did not watch the sports ball, even though I live in Los Angeles.
Yeah, not my thing. But I was paying attention to the amount of chicken consumed. So Americans ate somewhere around the neighborhood of 1.45 billion chicken wings. And, that's a lot of chickens. And to produce that number of chickens at scale for a single night required a cold chain, required, I don't know how many, I think it's like an average of 12 pounds of feed per chicken, plus hormones, plus antibiotics, plus.
So you cannot carry that capacity without things like factory farming.
Exactly.
And that's the sad truth.
Exactly. Now, but let's go into the future a couple of years, 5 years, and say, like, everybody still wants their chicken wings. Is there another way to create chicken wings that are not soy products? Because that's kind of weird, but, still chicken tissue. And the answer is yes. You can do that in a bioreactor. You start with a stem cell, not of a factory farm chicken, but like, let's get a heritage chicken, like a really nice old school chicken. Put that into a bioreactor, give it rich amino acids, keep it nice and snuggly and warm as it grows. Don't put any hormones in there. Don't put any antibiotics in there. And in a couple of weeks, you have the meat of a chicken that is natural, that has only natural elements, that just was never attached to a living, breathing chicken that clucked. We can do that now for around $17 for like a small portion of chicken. In a couple of years, we're going to be able to do that at scale. And what that potentially portends is a future in which Americans can have 2 billion chicken wings and require no chickens in the process.
And do it sustainably and humanely. I mean, it's very similar to a lot of the arguments I hear. So I'm very pro GM. I'm very pro GMOs. I think that I have issues sometimes with the way that certain companies patent things. I have issues, but I feel like those are separate issues from the actual transgenic technology, which I think is it's life-saving. And what I struggle with a lot is this like organic lobby who's like, you can't use GM crops. When I'm like, but
at this point, everything is kind of modified.
Well, and also GM is the way to be able to fulfill the promise of organics. You know what I mean? Like, we're not going to be able to feed the planet with like heirloom tomatoes in people's backyards. Like, we have to be smart about how we do our agriculture. And there are ways to be able to develop crops that are more resistant to pests, that are where we don't have to use so many pesticides, where we don't have to use so many herbicides. Like, GM is the future of being able to be more, quote, natural. And yet there's a disconnect in most people's minds between that, because I do think they fall victim to this naturalistic fallacy that like, if it's of the earth, it's inherently healthier. And it's like, no, just like your example with the chicken, like we're using really sophisticated technology to be able to get back to a product that is more meaningful and healthy and happier and all of that stuff. But the process is very scientific. And I think a lot of people are afraid of the process because they think it inherently affects the quality of the product. And that's a disconnect of, sadly, I think sometimes just not having the basic scientific knowledge.
Right. So it's the knowledge. It's also like, I mean, quite honestly, all of these regulations are fine, but it's not like there's enough human people who work in these places to go around and do the checks that are required. I mean,
no, of course,
again,
this is mostly honor system.
Right. So if we're going to get serious about our future and if we want to continue living on this planet and eating food, like if you are a human who likes to eat food and drink water, and have clothing and,
Have
COVID
a roof
aside,
over your
not
head.
not
Yeah.
wear a mask all the time because of smog, then we have to take different approaches. And unfortunately, we can't spend the next 30 years debating and hemming and hawing and kicking the can down the road. We're going to have to, yeah, we have to accept that things can be different, and different is not necessarily tantamount to horrific or bad. I think we've just gotten to this sort of habit of catastrophizing all the time. And or on the flip side of this, everybody's making bold promises that are like totally utopian and unobtainable. Like, let's put our pragmatist hats on and be bold and investigate and lean in with curiosity and come up with some long range plans.
And solutions to the inevitable risks that are going to accompany these things. Like,
Right.
we
And
have to think
also,
about that.
yeah, and be willing to continually recalibrate. Just because, like, this book that we wrote has 9 risks that are detailed. And that is true today. 2 years from now, we may have very different risks. So I think this is a matter of, there's a sort of joke slash axiom in statistics about, revisiting your priors, just going back over and over again and making sure that the assumptions that you're making and the data sets that you have are still meaningful. We got to revisit our priors when it comes to risk and opportunity, and we have to be willing to adjust. I think it's the adjust piece that's so hard for people.
It absolutely is. And we have to, yeah, I think, and that's sort of a movement towards thinking more scientifically, right? A movement towards saying we're going to work with what's, with the available evidence, and we're going to iterate over and over. And it's going to change based on what we know. And I think that part has long been very difficult for a lot of people to stomach. I think we've seen that with the pandemic, but you told us the vaccine would lead to XYZ. You told us, and it's like, well, yeah, based on the best available evidence, that's what we thought would happen. And then life happened. And now we have to, come up with a new game plan.
You made me think of something kind of interesting, or at least it's interesting to me. Scientists use the scientific method in their work, but they don't really apply the scientific method to like their broader thinking.
No, most people don't.
Yeah. So
yeah.
like it's wonderful that you're willing to design, test, build, rinse and repeat and do lots and lots of tests and learn and evaluate and recalibrate. Like, why? Like, you should also be doing that as you're thinking about organizational development or the structure of your lab or like the teams of people or what you're teaching or how you're bringing people into programs or, yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Gosh, Amy, there's so much to grapple with. I mean, I could honestly
Yeah, we
talk to
kind
you
of
for like
were
2
all
more
over the
hours.
place. Sorry,
No, I love it.
I'm the
'Cause the thing
definition
is,
of a nonlinear thinker.
same. And also, like, what I don't ever like to do when I talk to authors of books is like just recap their book in the podcast. Like, that's the whole point. Go read the damn book. I'm glad that we got all over the place and we're able to really grapple with some big things. But I do want to close with my final 2 questions. Before I do, though, I'm wondering if you could just kind of maybe recap for us a little bit. What is the Genesis machine and why does it matter?
Sure. So the Genesis machine itself is the complex apparatus of the scientists, research labs, computer systems, government agencies, and businesses that are redesigning and creating new forms of life. And I think that this Genesis machine is what's going to power humanity's great transformation. Last century, scientists focused on taking things apart, tissues, cells, and proteins, learning how they functioned. This century, scientists are going to try to make new things out of life's building blocks. So that is the Genesis machine, and that is the basis for our book, which we wrote for scientists to read, but mostly for everyday people. But when the time comes that you have to start making decisions about life and about food and water and everything else, that you feel confident making those decisions because you've got good information and you've thought about it.
Absolutely. So, I close my episodes asking everybody the same 2 questions. You may have already fully answered these during the episode, but I don't want to make assumptions. So I'm going to ask anyway. And you can either say, yeah, this is what I think. We already talked about it, or we can go deep, depending on where you want to go with this. So these are big picture questions, and they have to do with the future, which is like what you do for a living. I want to know first, when you think about the future, if you had to pick a singular thing that's sort of keeping you up the most at night, that's concerning to you, that is feeling very maybe you're tending towards more of a pessimistic or even like a cynical view. What are you deeply concerned about? And then on the flip side, so we end on a slightly more positive note, where are you actually finding hope and optimism when you think about the future? And this could be at any sort of scale or context, personal, professional, global, cosmic, whatever.
So as a futurist, I actually get asked this question all the time. And here at this moment in time is my answer. My answer to this question about what keeps me up at night, what scares me the most about the future, is that humanity is failing the marshmallow test. Do you know the marshmallow test?
Yes, we absolutely are. That's such a great way to put it.
So for those of you not familiar with the marshmallow test, I think it was like in the 70s. Kids were put into a room. They were told they could eat one marshmallow now, or if they waited a little while, they could have more marshmallows. Kids who demonstrated patience, meaning they were able to see themselves in the future getting more of what they wanted, delicious, squishy marshmallows. They tended to be successful adults when they grew up. But that was very few people. Most people, and most of those kids wanted the marshmallow right now. Humanity wants its marshmallow right now. It will not wait. All right. And impatience, our collective insistence on eating the marshmallow, our impatience explains how we got to this breaking point. This is how we have a COVID crisis. This is why we have a climate crisis. This is why we have inexcusable wealth disparity. This is why young millennials and Gen Z probably will not have as much economic opportunity as baby boomers. This explains a lot. And I think we can make a collective decision that we're going to wait. We're going to be patient. We want more marshmallows in the future. And that we're willing to buckle down and do the work that needs to be done to get those marshmallows. So I'll stop using the analogy, but this is my way of saying we are not envisioning ourselves in the future. And we are so fixated on right now. And what that really means is that we're not reverse engineering the future that we want. We're just sort of accepting what's there. And I think that is I think we have a moral imperative to each other, let alone to the place that we call home, our planet, to do a better job.
Absolutely.
So what keeps me up is that humanity is facing the marshmallow test. And while I think we have a way around that, I just don't see anybody doing very much to solve for that issue.
Right. So because of that, is where you're finding your optimism, is it tied to that pessimism, or is it a totally different sort of vista? Because we're not really seeing a lot of evidence of people passing the marshmallow test.
Here's the optimism, such as it is. The optimism is that I think that many generations from now, people will look back at this time as a time where critical decisions were made. And I'm hoping that there is a way for us to decide that we want better. Because if we make a decision that we want to do better and we want to be better, do you know how amazing it's going to be for the people we are part of humanity's next great transformation. 300 years from now, people will look back at this moment in time, literally this moment, as the moment in which the James Webb telescope went out and changed our beliefs, rewrote the laws of our reality, forced us to reperceive who we are and where we are. Synthetic biology finally gave us right access to life. It changed the permissions. It changed our compact with nature in ways that ultimately, were better. We are standing on the precipice of incredible species changing, reality altering technologies that we can use for good, that I'm hoping we choose to use for good, because how cool is it that we're the ones alive today? It's us. we're the ones that are building this next great transformation. I mean, I think that's so exciting. And I think we have the opportunity to do it in a responsible way. We just have to make the choice to do that. So I guess that's the optimistic scenario. And I guess there's a part of me that most of the time I focus on risk, but I'm always hopeful, I'm always hopeful that we choose to do better.
Here, here. Well, everybody, the book is The Genesis Machine, Our Quest to Rewrite Life in the Age of Synthetic Biology by Amy Webb and Andrew Hessel. Amy, thank you so much for being here with us today.
I really love talking to you. Thank you so much. And thanks for the work that you're doing on your PhD. I think it's really important.
Oh, thank you. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.